The first thing I saw when I walked into my kitchen was a woman in my chair wearing my bathrobe, eating eggs off my plate like she'd lived there her whole life. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Who are you? Get out of my house." That's one hell of a sentence to hear in a home you've owned for 22 years. My name is Walter Greer. I spent 40 years in federal property law, which means I know exactly what ownership means on paper. Deeds, easements, title records, all of it. I also know what it means in your bones. I know what it feels like when you spend 11 years restoring a 137-year-old house room by room until every crack in the plaster and every stair tread feels tied to your own memory. That house on Ashford Hill wasn't just where I lived. It was where I rebuilt my life after my wife Margaret died. I bought it in 2002, an old Victorian mansion sitting above the road like it still expected carriages to pull up out front. Wraparound porch, carved woodwork, limestone foundation, 11 rooms, and enough deferred maintenance to scare off any sensible person. The roof was failing, the wiring was ancient, the bathrooms looked trapped in 1964, and half the house felt like it had been waiting for somebody to care again. I loved it immediately. So I saved it. I spent 11 years restoring that place. Roof first, then plaster, then wiring, then the porch, which nearly beat me. I painted every room myself. My son Daniel came one summer and worked beside me, and for the first time in years, the place didn't feel quite so quiet. By 2013, the house was finished, not flipped, not prettied up, but restored. Done right. That's why what happened next felt personal in a way I can't fully put into words. A few months ago, I had a heart episode minor, according to the doctors, serious enough for my cardiologist to tell me to stop acting like I was made of fence wire and stubbornness. Daniel insisted I recover with him in Portland after the procedure. I argued. Then I went. Before I left, I did what I always do. Locked every door, checked every window, armed. The alarm stopped the mail set. The heat low lined up the bills. I also asked my neighbor, Ed Callum, to keep an eye on the place. Ed's a retired principal, the kind of man who notices if a squirrel crosses the street out of schedule. I told him, if anything looks wrong, call me. He did call me on day 5. Trouble was, I didn't hear the voicemail until day 8. Recovery had me tired, medicated, and sleeping strange hours. When I finally listened to the message, Ed said there were lights on in my house and a dark blue sedan in my driveway he didn't recognize. He'd seen it more than once. I packed in 10 minutes and drove home the next morning. The whole way back, I kept trying to find an innocent explanation. Service call, alarm glitch, somebody sent by mistake. But when I turned into my driveway at 7:15 and saw that blue sedan sitting there like it belonged, every excuse dried up. I opened my front door with my key. My alarm code worked. The front hall looked fine, but the house smelled wrong coffee, shampoo, cooked food. Somebody else's morning. I walked toward the kitchen and found Karen Mossfield, president of the Ashford Hill HOA, sitting in my chair. Now, Karen and I had never properly met. I knew her through violation letters, the occasional petty notice that showed up in my mailbox over the years, usually answered by me with one polite paragraph proving she was mistaken. She knew my name. She knew my house. Apparently, she did not know my face. So when I stepped into my own kitchen and said, "Good morning," she looked up irritated and said, "Who are you? What are you doing in here?" I said, "I live here." She shot to her feet. "This is private property. You need to leave right now." I looked at the pan on my stove, the coffee in my mug, 2 pieces of mail on my counter with her name and my address, and a grocery list written on my personalized notepad. And suddenly I wasn't angry. I was clear. There's a moment in any legal mess when the fog lifts and you realize the other person has confused a lack of resistance with actual authority. That's where I was. I turned off the burner, sat down at the other end of the table and said, "My name is Walter Greer. I own this house. I have the deed in my car. You should absolutely call the police." She did. And while she told 911 there was an intruder in her residence, I sat there looking around my kitchen. Her mail on my counter, her handwriting on my paper. It would have been funny if it hadn't been my life. The deputies arrived in 14 minutes. Karen got to them first. She said she was there in an official HOA capacity, conducting a welfare and property management function during my absence, and that I had entered unlawfully. She said it with the smooth confidence of somebody who'd been playing president so long she thought the title had become law. The senior deputy asked me for identification. I handed him my license and a copy of my deed. Then he asked Karen for hers. That was the first crack. He looked at her license, then at mine, then at the deed and said, "Ma'am, your address is not this address." Karen pivoted fast. Said the HOA had an emergency master key program. Said the board approved it. Said she had authority to enter homes for welfare checks. The deputy asked if she had written authorization, a board resolution, or my consent. She had none of them. What she did have was a master key sitting on my kitchen counter next to my notepad, like the dumbest piece of evidence I've ever seen. While the deputies sorted things out, I started documenting the house, room by room, the way I'd done for 40 years. Her bags in my master bedroom, her clothes hanging in my closet, her toiletries spread across half my bathroom vanity, groceries in my refrigerator which I had emptied before leaving, 2 pieces of forwarded mail addressed to her at my home. This wasn't some one-night mistake. She had moved in. 9 days, maybe longer if Ed hadn't called. Then the real twist landed. I called Diane Rohr, an attorney, an old colleague who knows county property records like a preacher knows scripture. I told her to pull everything on the HOA bylaws, resolutions, amendments, all of it. She called back within the hour. There was no valid master key program, no recorded resolution, no bylaw amendment, no homeowner consent. Nothing in the HOA documents allowed any officer to enter private homes. What Karen had been calling policy was just Karen cutting keys to other people's houses and handing all of them to herself. 11 more homes. That changed the whole shape of the story. This wasn't one woman overstepping in my house. This was somebody who had been playing private ruler over an entire neighborhood and hoping nobody looked too closely at the paperwork. The deputies looked at her differently after that. She was escorted upstairs to gather her things while an officer watched. I stayed in the kitchen and poured myself a cup of the coffee she'd made. I'll tell you something honest, that was a satisfying cup of coffee. Not because it was especially good, though it was decent, but because I was drinking it in my house while the woman who tried to claim it was packing her shampoo under supervision. There's a kind of justice that doesn't need shouting. It just needs witnesses. By afternoon, Diane had filed complaints for trespass, unlawful entry, and regulatory violations tied to those unauthorized keys. Ed gave a statement about the car and the lights. Another resident, Gerald Foss, stepped forward too. Turns out he'd challenged Karen's master key idea 2 years earlier and got brushed off. He'd been waiting a long time for somebody to force that issue into daylight. And daylight does terrible things to nonsense. Karen resigned 3 days later. The HOA held an emergency meeting, formally dissolved the key program, and passed a new recorded rule banning any future entry into private homes without written homeowner consent for that specific entry. Her criminal case ended in a deferred prosecution agreement. The civil settlement required her to sign a recorded acknowledgement stating she had no legal right to enter, occupy, control, or represent any authority over my property. Recorded permanently. That mattered to me more than any apology would have. I didn't need tears. I didn't need a scene. I needed the truth pinned down in the one place people like Karen can't talk their way out of the record. And that's the lesson I took from all of it. The most dangerous people aren't always the loudest or cruelest. Sometimes they're the ones who start believing their own excuses. Give somebody a title, a little applause, a little unchecked access, and sooner or later they stop seeing the line between helping a community and ruling one. Power doesn't usually arrive wearing a villain's face. Most of the time it shows up carrying a clipboard. A week later, I changed my alarm code. Had that key destroyed, signed a proper observer form with Ed for any future absences, and walked through the house one more time before heading back to Portland. Same hall, same staircase, same library, same notepad on the desk, with the third sheet missing where Karen had torn out her grocery list. I left it that way on purpose. A missing page makes a fine reminder. When I stood at the end of the drive looking back at that old house on the hill, it was still mine in every way that matters in labor, in memory, in law, and now in writing. That house had outlasted men with money, men with titles, and one HOA president who got a little too comfortable in somebody else's bathrobe. And I won't lie, watching her back that dark blue sedan out of my driveway was one of the most satisfying things I've seen in years. So here's what I want to ask you: when somebody hides behind a title and starts treating your rights like a technicality, how far is too far before it stops being leadership and becomes plain abuse? Tell me what you think. Who was right? Who was wrong? And have you ever dealt with somebody drunk on a little bit of authority? Share your take. And if you've lived through something like this, I'd like to hear your story.